Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to welcome you to another edition of BPO Industry Insights. It's a series of the interviews with experts, with CEOs, with the directors of the ports, when we can try to discuss the recent challenges for the ports, for the shipping sector. And of course, last years and also recent events in Ukraine are having big consequences for our sector, for ports, for shipping, also in the Baltic Sea region. We had the pandemic, which started in year 2020. Then the Russian aggression started on Ukraine on 24th of February 2022. And then this year, quite recently, we had the lockdowns in main Chinese megacities. And of course, as a consequence, also the problems in operations of the ports in China. So in last years, last months, we have seen a lot of disruptions of supply chain, ships waiting weeks to be able to enter the ports, goods not being delivered on time, then Christmas present not delivered for Christmas. Then more seriously, Ukraine being blocked from the seaside, export cargo which is not able to be sent to the customers. All this we would like to tackle during the series of our BPO Industry Insights. Our first guest for today is Mr. Lars Jensen. Lars Jensen is the CEO of the company Vespucci Maritime, CEO and the partner. And Lars has a very strong and long-standing experience from shipping clients. He worked for Maersk Line for quite many years. He also had a PhD in theoretical physics, so having ability to look more systematic to shipping sector. Lars, maybe you at the beginning would like to say a few words about your company and what you are recently doing.
Well, what I do in Vespucci Maritime, despite having worked at different companies, I've been an independent analyst for the last 11 years. And usually I explain it very simply. What I do is I try to figure out why things are happening in the container shipping industry, and then use that to figure out what is going to happen down the line. And I usually then provide those insights to shippers, carriers, ports, terminals, IT companies, sometimes providing insights into what's going to happen the next few months, sometimes the next few years, sometimes the next 20 or 30 years, depending on perspective. But short story is, for 20 years, I've been trying to figure out what is coming down the line, and that's what I'm still doing.
Thank you, Lars, and thank you for being with us today. And of course, you know that this times are very, from one hand, interesting, but from the other hand, are very challenging for many players. And you know that for last 2.5 years, there have been a lot of events related to the pandemic and a lot of consequences for the maritime transport. We also experienced lockdowns, of course. And then quite recently, on 24th of February, the Russian aggression started on Ukraine. And then again, we have been experiencing a series of lockdowns in Chinese mega cities, and then the consequences for the port operations in China. So there have been a lot of things going on in the last 2.5 years. And there was a lot of consequences for the maritime sector, as I said. But having this in mind, should I ask you a first questions? May I start with the war in Ukraine? Can I ask you, what are the most visible effects of the conflict now, also on the global trade? Can you tell us about these consequences?
I can, and now, of course, I know a lot of your viewers here will be focused on the Baltic region, but let me start with a global and then drill into the Baltic. From the global perspective, with the risk of sounding slightly cynical, this is not a major important part for container shipping. It impacts bulk shipping, tanker shipping globally more than it does container shipping for a number of reasons. From a global perspective, the volumes related to Ukraine and Russia are not large, not on a global scale. From a logistical setup, neither Russia nor Ukraine are major transshipment hubs. They're both at the ends of the supply chain. So from that perspective, the impact is purely on Ukraine and Russia, but doesn't have large ramifications from a global standpoint. The main impact you're seeing from a global standpoint is the indirect effect of the vast increases in fuel costs, which of course is passing throughout the system to everybody that uses ships. Now, that's from the global perspective. If we narrow it down to a European perspective, there are some localized effects, absolutely. The first effect that happened, and it happened fairly quickly, was as the war started, you still had thousands of containers on ships inbound for Ukraine and Russia, which obviously cannot be delivered. So they got stuck in European ports and terminals. We already had massive congestion problems in Europe. This just added to those congestion problems. It is still an issue in some ports. Other places, what we're beginning to see is shipping lines are moving these containers typically to smaller ports and facilities, and where some of these containers are going to stay basically for an indefinite period of time until they can be removed. That's a more direct impact. If we look up into the Baltic, there are two additional impacts coming out of this. Clearly, with cargo trickling down to a halt going into Russia, that is still a significant amount of the volume that goes up into the Baltic, which means the number of services servicing the Baltic is being reduced because there's not enough cargo to fill all of them. So that leads to a knock-on effect on other countries around the Baltic of reduced service coverage. Also, trade imbalances tended to be, you had a lot of cargo moving in, especially to St. Petersburg in Russia. Then you have a lot of empty containers, which tended to serve markets like Finland, where of course now with no cargo going into Russia, that's also then disrupting the empty flows and thereby having knock-on effects in the region. So to maybe boil it down, again, to be slightly cynical from a global perspective, specifically on containers, the impact until now is relatively limited. The Baltic is one of the regions where you probably see some of the larger knock-on effects.
Thank you very much. In fact, I'm having in front of me the latest results from the Baltic ports in container throughputs. And I can see that in the first quarter, integrated over the first 3 months, data showing that there is a drop more than 10% in port of St. Petersburg, and a huge drop in Kaliningrad, 25%. As I said, it is the integrated. So in March, you can even have much more than this level. But having this data, the first data after the war started, what do you expect in a whole year? What the volume of the containers could be in Russian ports?
I would expect that, I mean, for the port of St. Petersburg to drop much, much more than what you have the numbers for there. If you look at, I would say, basically the first month of the war, and I know it is controversial because there's a lot of politics involved, where most of the container carriers relatively quickly said, we're going to cease booking acceptance into Russia, but they continued operations. So it's one of these where it's problematic no matter what decision you make. You have a lot of containers going to Russia. Do you leave them stranded in European ports? To some degree, the answer was yes. Or do you keep moving some of the cargo, and more importantly, also then get your empty containers out of Russia? Whereas clear in the beginning phases of the war, especially getting some of the empty containers out was judged more important by some of the carriers to carry that one on. Now we are basically 2.5 months into the war. We are coming close on 3 months soon, and this is trickling to a halt. So those numbers for port operations, especially in St. Petersburg, is going to drop a lot more than what you have here. And the sad state of affairs is there is right now no end date to this. It is hard to see when the war is going to stop and when sanctions are going to stop.
Yeah, you are very right. But this, I mean, it has also had consequences for the transshipment hubs in the Baltic, like DCT in Gdańsk, but also for some ports in the North Sea. Can you say a few words? What do you expect for these ports?
Yeah, the challenge is, and that's where I don't have a crystal ball that is good enough at that level of granularity. The challenge for any transshipment hub is, of course, the combination. You need large ships to come in, and you need a lot of feeders. I mean, it's a symbiotic relationship. With feeder coverage being somewhat reduced into the Baltics because of reduced volume into Russia, the attraction of calling some of these major hubs also becomes less. I don't think that's going to change anything here in 2022. But if you go into a horrible scenario where this persists in 23 and 24, if I were one of the major carriers or major alliances, I might start to contemplate how many of my deep sea services do I need to go to these very northern ports when suddenly I got a lot less cargo going up there. It's not going to lead to any major changes of the networks, I would assume, right here in 22, but that would be a potential longer term impact.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me now turn to another area, the security and energy policy. One of the results of the war in Ukraine in EU is the shift towards the different sources of energy for Europe, for European Union. What challenges or opportunities can you see presenting themselves to shipping and port sector based on said shifts?
For the port sector specifically, I'm not sure it changes all that much. Again, looking purely from the container shipping perspective. If you look at what has happened the last few years, there's been a drive, especially by some of the carriers, to move towards LNG-powered ships. Now, clearly, with the change in energy policy, there's probably a lot of very worried senior people in some of those carriers when you look at what is happening to gas prices. Again, is that permanent or not? I would rather start to see this in a different light, and let me try to put at least a bit of positive news out there, because what the energy crisis here is very likely to also do is further accelerate some of the decarbonization initiatives that is happening in the industry. That is not going to decarbonize the industry overnight. This is still a process that will take a couple of decades. But if we are to look for anything positive coming out of these problems, it likely is that this will add as an accelerant moving towards some of the decarbonized fuels. From a port perspective, I don't have any illusions that we're going to see ports suddenly become major producers of green fuels. That's not what they do. That's not their business models. But it would more be a matter for the ports to pay very close attention to how rapidly is this changing. What will it take to be able to provide those fuels? Again, you're not going to be asked to provide 1 million tons of green fuel in 2023. That's not how it works. But it is time for all the ports to start to contemplate in the longer term strategies. How are they going to be able to serve that coming part of the market?
Thank you very much. Lars, you are a well-known expert when it comes to observing and analyzing the flow of container markets, which is said to be currently in what is called a super cycle. Could you give us a brief explanation of what is meant under that terms, as well as how will it unfold in context of continuous increase in container vessel size as a container shortage, please?
Yeah. There's about 1 million different moving parts all at the same time. Now, when we talk about the cycles in container shipping, what's typically meant is you've had for decades had the same type of cycles where the market turns strong because there's more demand and supply. The carriers order more vessels, then they order too many vessels, then we got oversupply and rates go down, then they don't order any vessels, and on we go. To some degree, that's an underlying cycle we also have now. If you think back a bit over 10 years ago, the carriers over-ordered far too much capacity and rates dropped. When we were then looking at the market at the end of 2019, just before the pandemic, the order book was historically low. We were already set to go into a strong upcycle because of a low order book. Normally, you would then expect the market to go strong 2020, 2021. then the carriers would order vessels and the downturn would again begin in 23. And that's actually also what we see. We have a very large order book now for 2023 and for 2024. So underlying the pandemic, we still see this cycle. It's just the cycle is much larger now than we're used to because of the pandemic. It's a number of different domino effects that has led to all the congestion in the ports. Congestion in the ports means that ships are waiting. That means effectively we are removing capacity. And the latest numbers I have there for March here of 2022, because of all the delays globally, it's about 12% of the global fleet that is not available because vessels are waiting. So it's a 12% capacity reduction. That is causing these astronomically high freight rates that we're seeing in the market, which in turn also means extremely high charter rates on the ships, and it's causing all the turmoil. If we look slightly ahead, the market at some point is going to normalize. We're going to get off these extremely high rates. But the trigger point here is actually not the delivery of the new vessels. The most important part is fixing the bottleneck problems so we can get this 12% capacity back into action. And realistically, this is not going to be normal until sometime during 2023. It's going to take a long time to unravel all the bottlenecks that we have. The baseline scenario, at least I'm looking at, is if we assume nothing further bad happens. And so that's not a good assumption because the last 2 years, it's been one piece of new bad news after another. But if we assume there are no more curveballs going ahead, my expectation would then be we're going to get another problem in the coming months when Shanghai reopens. We're going to have a strong peak season. And then we're going to have this journey towards normality to be achieved sometime during 2023, but not until then. And that's if we don't have any curveballs. There are two major risks, well, actually three, one of them being what if the Russian war starts to spread? But I don't want to speculate in that because anything goes on that one and nobody really knows. The two other risks that are more important to take note of, one is the risk of further lockdowns in China. I know everybody is looking for when is Shanghai going to reopen, but let's not forget that Shanghai problem is because China still has a policy of zero COVID. And they still have the very contagious Omicron variant to deal with. So the risk here is not that we're going to see a surge from Shanghai reopening. The risk is even more shutdowns in China in the months ahead. The other major risk, which fortunately we haven't seen in full force, but it's a major risk, it has been flagged as a major risk for the last 5 months, would be cyber attacks from Russia on Western critical infrastructure, something that the intelligence agencies across both North America and Europe started to warn about already back in January. Keep in mind, if you think back 5 years ago in 2017, this is when Maersk was brought to its knees. They were completely off for about a week, took them several weeks to come back up and running. Back then, 5 years ago, nobody actually attacked Maersk. What happened back then was a Russian attack on the state of Ukraine. 7,000 companies got hit. Maersk was just one of them. So if that is what can happen if you are not being the direct target, what could then potentially happen if Russia decides to use their offensive capabilities against critical infrastructure? And from that perspective, I actually don't see the largest risk to the infrastructure here being if you attack a shipping company. The largest risk is if you attack the ports and terminals. Because what is right now the main problem, despite you can see ships that are waiting, the problem is actually the congestion in the terminals. And attacking a major terminal, even if that terminal is well prepared, could lead to them being out of action for, say, 3, 4, 5 days. And that would make the congestion we see now much, much worse. That is the largest risk scenario. And it has been with us for the last 4 or 5 months. We're lucky that it hasn't materialized. That's great. Let's hope it continues that way. But if there is one curveball that could make 22 even more challenging than 21, that would be it.
Thank you, Lars. In fact, you started to talk about the consequences of the situation in Shanghai. And this is my last question, but since you have already partly replied to that question, maybe we should focus more about the consequences for Europe and for our regional Baltic market. So if this situation, if the lockdown and the problems in operations in Chinese ports would continue, what do you expect in European ports and in the Baltic? What would be the long-term consequences for our region?
There are multiple consequences on different timescales. First, when Shanghai shut down, the carriers actually did what I would say is the right thing, because they continued to call Shanghai, even though there was not as much cargo to pick up, because that at least allowed them to move cargo into Shanghai to reposition empties. And this is the key. We got peak season coming up. If you don't reposition empties into Shanghai and Shanghai then reopens, we would run out of empty containers. But we're now getting into the problem that when Shanghai reopens, there's likely to be a surge of cargo coming out of China. And at the moment, because Shanghai is not reopened, we start to see shipping lines cancel sailings. That will mean with a month of time lag, we will see less vessels arrive up here in Europe. We'll see less cargo. That will help us at least clear some of the port congestion, which of course is going to be nice, and everybody will be happy when that happens. But when Shanghai reopens, we'll have the opposite effect. Then you're going to see a surge of cargo, again with a month of time lag, arrive up here in North Europe. And we're going to see bottleneck problems arise once again. And the surge of cargo could actually be quite severe, because we'll have two elements overlapping. We'll have the reopening of Shanghai, so there'll be cargo that didn't move. There'll be factories trying to catch up the lost production. But this might coincide with peak season. Normally, there will still be a few months before we really get into peak season. But if you look at the supply chain from Asia to North Europe, if you look at some of the benchmarks from, for example, Flexport, well, the supply chain right now takes about 2 months longer than what it normally does. It also did that to some degree last year. And a lot of the importers, if you remember back last year, were extremely worried, will my goods actually arrive in time for Christmas sales? So a lot of those importers, they're placing their orders already now, because they have to figure out 2 months more in the supply chain, which means that the peak season is just about to start 2 months early. And that start of the peak season could well coincide then with a reopening of Shanghai, and that will lead to a very large surge of cargo then arriving in North Europe, creating more congestion problems. So I'll say that is the medium term, that we're going to get huge congestion problems once this arrives in the ports. Then there is another element that's going to play out over several years. And I think this is probably potentially one of the only permanent changes as a result of the pandemic, because up until now, what the pandemic has done is accelerate things that were already happening. It has accelerated, for example, digitalization and the use of digital tools, but it was not new. But it's going to lead to a change of sourcing. In early 2020, when China shut down, the rest of the world also shut down. And well, okay, that was COVID. In 2021, when China shut down, when we had the shutdowns in Yantian and in Ningbo, well, the rest of the world to some degree also shut. Also to some degree also shut down. This time it's different. Most of the world is open. It's only China that shuts down. And this is not from the transportation perspective. This is manufacturing. And you are likely to see an effect right now where a lot of importers across the world, especially in Europe and North America, they will start to say, when they look at their plans for the coming years, how many of their orders for production will they place in China? And how often will they say, once the contracts come up for renewal, or when we're contemplating establishing new facilities, maybe we should place some of those outside China. Maybe we should place them in Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and other places like this. Because the risk here is you got a new element. You got a Chinese government policy that is preventing you from using your production facilities. That is a new card on the table. And it is very likely that this, not over the coming months, but over the coming years, will gradually lead to a reduction in the amount of production that's placed in China, and an increase in production placed elsewhere in Asia.
Well, this is really very interesting. So you're expecting in the longer term less production to be placed in China, and this could move to another destinations in in Asia.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Lars, it is always a pleasure to talk to you about the recent market and all these challenges. And thank you for being with us this time. And I'm sure you will be present in one of our events here in the Baltic, and we could talk to you directly. And I know you're coming for one of the events here in Gdynia, Transport Week in June. So we are very much looking forward to see you here in Poland.
Thank you for inviting me here, and I'm definitely looking forward to coming down to Gdynia. It'll be my first trip to Gdynia, so I'm looking very much forward to it.
We're also looking forward to meet you very soon. Lars, thanks a lot and see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, please stay tuned for further episodes coming soon to our YouTube channels, but also follow our other social media channels. Thank you very much.